A whole family was murdered in cold blood. The father, the mother, their daughter, and the son. And in the last 20 years since the murder, over 280,000 investigators have been tied to this case, along with over 16,000 pieces of evidence. And in the last 24 years since, we are still in the dark as much as we were 24 years ago. This is the Setagaya Murders. Welcome to Patterns of Behavior, where we focus on the people behind the crime. I'm Ed Choi, and today we're going to be talking about the murders of the Miyazawa family. And this is a really big case. In the last 24 years, this has become Japan's largest investigation. And this was actually the case that changed a law in Japan where they abolished the statute of limitations for prosecuting violent crimes. And in the last 24 years, because of the circumstances of the case, this case has essentially become urban legend, and a lot of the facts have become twisted and misconstrued. And although no one can be 100% accurate, I'm going to try to lay out this case as accurately as possible. So the year is 2000 when the new millennium took place, but in Japan, they celebrated the new millennium, ringing it in 2001. And this kind of makes sense because typically when you count, it's 1 to 10, 11 to 20, which means that the last millennium should have taken place from 1001 till the year 2000, which means the new millennium technically should begin in 2001 till the year 3000. And in a western suburb of Tokyo, in a decently well-off neighborhood known as Setagaya, a family of 4 lived in a house. The father of the family is 44-year-old Mikio Miyazawa, who worked for a London-based marketing company known as Interbrand, who was the company that actually coined the term Wi-Fi. And Mikio was described by his coworkers and as his neighbors as someone who got along with everyone. His wife was 41-year-old Yasuko Miyazawa, who was a teacher and was beloved by everyone as well. And the two of them had 2 children, an 8-year-old daughter named Niina, who was in 2nd grade and loved ballet and soccer, and a 6-year-old son, Ray, who was growing up a happy child with a slight speech impediment. And the Miyazawas lived at their home for the last 10 years before their children were born. And in fact, right next door lived Yasuko's mother, her sister, brother-in-law, and their 13-year-old child. And on December 30th, 2000, the Miyazawa family was getting ready for their New Year's Eve celebrations to ring in the new millennium the next night. And earlier that evening, roughly around 6 p.m., some of the family members go shopping, which was confirmed by someone who saw them at the shopping center, as well as a neighbor who stated that they saw that the family car was missing from the driveway roughly around 6:30. And roughly around 7 p.m. that night, Yasuko was speaking on the phone with her mother next door, who asked if Niina wanted to come over. And she went over to her grandmother's house next door roughly till about 9:30 because they were all watching a TV show together. And at 10:38 p.m., the father, Mikio, puts in a password to be able to read a work email. And the house that they live in actually backs up to a really large park, which we're going to get into a little bit later. And as the clock was approaching 11 p.m. that evening, the 6-year-old son, Ray, was fast asleep in his bed inside of the kid's bedroom. The mother, Yasuko, and their 8-year-old daughter, Niina, were in the parents' bedroom that's on the 3rd floor attic area that you access by going up a ladder stairs. And the father, Mikio, was in his office on the 1st floor finishing up some work. And while the family is going about their everyday nighttime routines, at 11 p.m., an unknown unsub enters their home. And it's been widely believed that this man entered through the back area of the house that backs up to the park, climbed a fence because there were some broken branches back there where the tree is, and climbed in through the 2nd floor bathroom window that's adjacent to the kid's room. However, the police have stated that they never found any clothing fibers in that window. And we do know that the front door was locked, which means that he did not enter through the front door because Mikio was also right there in the home office. And the other thing that we do know for sure is that the killer killed 6-year-old Ray first, who was fast asleep in his bed, was strangled to death. Now, in the kids' room on the 2nd floor, there is a balcony that is connected to their bedroom that you can access. And that balcony can also be easily climbed upon when the family car is parked in the driveway by just climbing over the car onto the balcony, which also seems to line up with the fact that Ray was the first target because when he climbed into the bedroom, the boy was fast asleep right there. Now, either from the man climbing into the house, whether it's through the bathroom or through the front balcony in the kids' room, either way, the father, Mikio, hears something going on upstairs and decides to go up to the second floor to check it out. And it seems that as Mikio is coming up the stairs, he is faced with the unsub at the top of the steps who has brought his own knife. And this isn't any knife. This is a sashimi bocho knife. And if you're familiar with knives, the sashimi bocho knife is made to be able to fillet fish. And it's not very tall, but it's very long because remember, the blade is meant to be able to fillet a fish, which means that the blade has to be longer than the width of most of the fish that people are filleting. And the unsub uses this knife to stab Mikio multiple times. Most of the lacerations happen around his neck and his head area. And in fact, at one point, part of that knife breaks off in Mikio's head. And in the process, Mikio falls down the stairs because his body is found at the bottom of the steps. But in that struggle, the unsub actually hurts his hand, and it's believed that he has a big laceration on his hand because there was a lot of blood that was found at the scene of the crime that did not belong to any of the Miyazawa family. And right in that hallway at the top of the steps where Mikio fell down the stairs is actually the landing point to the third floor attic bedroom stairs. And that man then uses that same broken knife to stab Yasuko and Niina. And both of their bodies were found at the bottom of the steps that go up to the third floor attic bedroom, which means that he either stabbed them at the top of the steps and they fell down, or they were trying to get away and ended up losing their lives trying to get down the stairs at the bottom of those steps. And in most murder cases, typically what ends up happening after the murder is either the people run or they stay behind to try to clean up any of the evidence so that they can't be linked to the crime. And this is the part where it gets really weird because this killer stayed behind, but not to do any cleanup. Now, one of the first things that the unsub does most likely after slaughtering the family is trying to tend to his wound, which is bleeding a lot, which is the reason why the police were able to find his blood on towels as well as feminine sanitary products. And it was also evident that he had used first aid kits to try to bandage up his wounds. And we don't know in which order all of these things took place, but we do know that around 1:18 in the morning, the unsub then uses the family computer that's in the home office on the first floor. And he doesn't use it to try to learn how to clean up bodies or blood or get away with murder or anything like that. In fact, one of the only things he does is click on one of the links that's bookmarked on that computer, almost as if he was just kind of bored or trying to figure out who these people were. And then later at 10:05 in the morning, the computer is waking up again, but we're not sure if he was still there at that time and then accessed the computer then as well. The unsub also takes the family's IDs and credit cards and he sorts them all out in the living room for no apparent reason. He also eats a bunch of their food. He drinks a couple of their barley teas that are in bottles. He eats a melon that has blood on it. And then he supposedly also eats 4 pints of ice cream, but not with a spoon. He eats it like he squeezed the pint to try to get the ice cream to squeeze out the top. And then he just bites into it like if he was eating an ice cream sandwich. He then uses the family bathroom to go number 2 and doesn't flush the toilet, as well as taking a lot of the family's belongings, including a lot of the garbage, like some of the ice cream wrappers and stuff like that. And he just throws it into the tub and into the toilet. And the unsub also steals roughly 150,000 yen, which equals out to be a little over $1,000 US. But the thing is he also left behind more than he took, because the police also found 250,000 yen, or roughly about $2,000 US, in the home office that they know that the unsub spent some time in. And as I stated earlier, the majority of killers who stay behind so that they can clean up all of the evidence so that there is nothing that links them to the crime left at the scene. However, this unsub did the complete opposite, as if he almost didn't care if he was going to get caught, or he was super sure that he was never going to get caught, because he actually left a bunch of stuff behind, majority being his clothes. So the unsub leaves behind the sushi knife that he brought with him to kill the family, as well as a bucket hat, a pair of black gloves, a brand new black Uniqlo jacket, a large fanny pack style bag, as well as a multicolored scarf and a baseball style t-shirt where the sleeves were purple and the middle of the t-shirt is white, as well as a folded black handkerchief that the police believe was ironed, that had the scent of Drakkar Noir cologne sprayed onto it. And that was in addition to all of the DNA that he left behind on the scene, including his blood, as well as footprints that he left behind inside of the house that allowed the police to be able to figure out what exact shoe that he was wearing. And all of this happened with Yasuko's mother, sister, brother-in-law, and 13-year-old living right next door. And if you're wondering how they didn't hear anything at all while their family was being slaughtered right next door, in fact, roughly around 11:30 p.m., while they were watching a specific show, they did hear a large thudding noise, which we don't really know what it is. It could have easily been one of the bodies falling down the stairs. Either way, Yasuko's mother, Haruko, tries to call them in the morning. And when no one answers, she thinks it's kind of weird. So she goes right next door and knocks on the door to realize that no one is answering, nor is she hearing any movements from within the house. So at 10:40 in the morning on New Year's Eve, right before the new millennium, Haruko goes inside of their home and finds all of their bodies. And that's as much as we know of what happened that evening. However, once the police start the investigation, we find out a bunch more information, because there's once again so much DNA everywhere. For instance, the police were able to deduce that the unsub ate string beans and sesame seeds the night before because of the feces that was left in the toilet. The police were actually able to also figure out that most of the clothes, as well as that sushi knife that the unsub brought over to the slaughtering, was purchased at the Kanagawa prefecture nearby just days before. In fact, the baseball-style shirt that the unsub was wearing was made by a brand where they only made 130 of those shirts, but the police were only able to find 12 of the owners who bought them. And the killer's fingerprints and DNA were left everywhere at the scene, and Japan didn't pass a law that they take the fingerprints of everyone who visits the country starting until 2007, which means that back in 2000, when this crime took place, depending on who this person was, that person's fingerprints was nowhere on the Japanese police's database. The police found that there were 3 types of fluorescent dyes that were present on the fanny pack and on the unsub shoes. And this piece of evidence that the police found is really what throws a large wrench into this case, because inside of that fanny pack, they found trace amounts of sand. Sand that specifically comes from Edwards Air Force Base located in Southern California. The police also know from the events that happened and the stab marks and things like that, that the unsub was also right-handed. And because DNA was still relatively a new thing in the year 2000, they weren't able to figure this part out until more recently. However, they were able to take the unsub's blood and run some tests on it. But the only thing is, in Japan, they have very strict privacy laws, which means that the police are restricted in what they're able to do with that blood without consent, which means that they're not able to run as many tests on it that would help to be able to solve this crime in Japan. But a big piece that they found through the blood, and they were able to find out that the unsub had type A blood, was 100% male. And they were able to use mitochondrial DNA testing to find out that his mother had some South European blood in her genealogy, most likely from a country near the Mediterranean or the Adriatic Sea. But because of the way the mitochondrial DNA tests work, they're not able to figure out the exact percentage. So most likely the man wasn't 50% white, but could have been that his great, 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 great grandmother had some South European blood in her. And through the DNA test, they were also able to further figure out that the father was of East Asian descent. In fact, the Y chromosome in his DNA showed markers for the haplogroup O-1M22, which is a common haplogroup that's distributed amongst East Asians, most specifically 1 in 5 Koreans, 1 in 10 Chinese, or 1 in 13 Japanese people. And that detail, amongst a lot of other details, made a lot of people think that the unsub most likely wasn't Japanese, but specifically most likely Korean in ethnicity. In addition, the police also found that all of the clothing were washed in hard water, which would be impossible for them to do in Japan because Japan has a very notorious soft water system. And they found a lot of other minerals that are typically not found in Japanese water. But do you know who does use a hard water system? A lot of countries, but specifically also South Korea, which then also fueled the idea that this unsub most likely could be of Korean descent. Also, remember when I stated earlier that the unsub left his footprints everywhere? Well, apparently that footprint came back to be a specific shoe. And that shoe was made by a brand called Slazenger, which is made in Korea. And the police believe the shoe size is either 27.5 centimeters or 27 centimeters. And the difference in the half centimeter makes a big difference because size 27 Slazenger shoes are imported into Japan from Korea. However, 27.5 are not imported into Japan and can only be bought in Korea. And based on all of that circumstantial evidence, a lot of people really started pushing the narrative that the unsub was of Korean ethnicity. And the Japanese media went wild with this theory, even posting newspaper headlines that stated that the unsub didn't look like a Japanese worker, but a foreign contractor. There was even a book written by an author using a pen name, so a fake name, and this person's identity has never been released to the public as well, as in this person who claims to be an investigative reporter also doesn't feel comfortable using their own name, which sounds extremely suspicious, as in not credible. Because in this book, this man goes on to state that they have talked to and have lifted a fingerprint from the scene that matched a Korean man in Korea. However, if any of what the information in that book was specifically true, then I would assume in the last however many years since that book came out, that the police in Japan would have gotten their man, but they haven't. In fact, they still don't really know who the person is. There was even a weird thing that happened exactly 100 days after the murders. On April 9th, 2001, in the back area of the house near this River Creek area, this Buddhist statue was found. And not just any Buddhist statue, but a Buddhist statue of this man named Jizo, who was regarded as the guardian of unborn children and children who died prematurely. And for some reason, the police initially thought that the person who left that statue there knew what happened to the family, or possibly was the killer himself, either paying respect or showing some sort of grievance. And the police believed this so much that they printed out 30,000 copies of the pamphlet that showed what the statue looked like and dispersed it around the area. And that's just the tip of the iceberg, but the majority of some of the weird stuff that happened in this case. However, all of the evidence and circumstances that are kind of weird make it for a lot of possible theories to come up of what could have potentially happened to the Miyazawa family that night. And of the theories, the most obvious one that typically happens when there is a home invasion with murders, specifically in Japan, is because of robberies. In fact, the police spoke to other robbers that broke into homes and murdered the families that were there, and found out that the majority of these people who ended up killing the families in Japan in home invasions were almost all for robberies. But this theory doesn't really work for a couple of reasons. First off, there is a much more affluent neighborhood really close by. And in addition, it's not like the Miyazawas were living in an extremely nice house. Yes, from the outside, it did look like it could be a large home, but remember, this home was actually two different units that were right next to each other, one of which the Miyazawas lived in, and one of which the wife's family lived in right next door. And yes, while money was stolen from the house, way more money, in fact, almost doubled the amount, was left behind from a room in the home that the unsub spent some time in, which means that he definitely would have found it if that's what he was there for. In addition, none of the valuables were taken from the home. Typically in home invasions, for people looking to steal money, they don't just steal the money, they take the jewelry, silverware, any nice china, decor. None of that was taken from the home. Another theory is that there is a large park that comes up right up to the property line of the Miyazawa house. And in fact, a lot of the neighbors had recently sold their homes and moved out so that this park could expand. In fact, the Miyazawas were looking to move in a couple of months as well. They were just waiting until the turn of the new year. But inside of this park is a skate park that essentially comes up right to the back of the Miyazawa house. And apparently just a week before the Miyazawa's family were slaughtered in their own home, Mikio had a confrontation with some of the skaters in the skate park where he went over to let them know that they were being too loud. And there were some claims that a witness supposedly stated that they saw Mikio having a confrontation with some motorcycle gang in Japan. But the thing about it is I doubt that the motorcycle gang were hanging out at the skate park. And in fact, I find it really hard to believe that someone would go up to a bunch of teenagers and young adults hanging out at a skate park, asking them, hey, do you guys mind? You're being a little bit too loud. My 6-year-old son is trying to sleep. And that someone from that group would get so offended to the point that they're going to come in, break into a home, and violently murder all 4 family members. That doesn't sound very likely, especially in a place like Japan, in East Asian culture. And I'm not saying everyone is like this, but the majority of people have a lot of respect for each other. And I think a lot of people really gravitated towards this part of the story because a lot of people associated the clothing that the unsub left behind to being akin to skater clothes. But we also have to remember, while this person did wear something that looked to be like a baseball tee, this was a designer clothing shirt. And I really don't think that it was one of the skaters that was in the back park personally. Now, in addition, on December 25th, on Christmas Day, just a week before the slaughter of their family, Yasuko told her father-in-law, so Mikio's father, that she had seen a suspicious car that was parked outside of their house a couple of times over the last couple of days. And while, yes, they do have a public park that's immediately behind their house, right in front of their home isn't great access into the park because it's fenced out, which means that the person would have to walk around their block to be able to access that park. So it doesn't really make sense that someone had parked there multiple times to go to the park. And if you also remember, because the majority of their neighbors had already moved out for the expansion of this park, I believe at the time in the home surrounding the park that it was looking to expand into, I believe everyone had moved out except for maybe 3 or 4 of the houses, one of which was the home of the Miyazawa family, which means that most likely wasn't a neighbor. And if you really think about it, that neighborhood on that block, even though it's not a secluded neighborhood because it is a very populated suburb of Tokyo, their block specifically was most likely pretty empty that week. Now, there are some claims that apparently on December 29th, a man that fits the very loose description, specifically described as wearing, quote, skater clothes, was seen at a train station about a couple of miles away from the Miyazawa family's home. And on that same day, Another man who was described to be wearing, quote, skater clothes at a nearby supermarket from that train station apparently bought the only sushi knife that was sold that day. And apparently, these merchants recognized and remembered someone wearing skater clothes because, again, it was around Christmas and New Year's time, which means it was in the dead of winter, and everyone else was dressed very warmly. And I can't tell if people in Japan are getting too stuck on this skater style thing, because if you look at the photo of the clothing that was left behind, one of them was a winter jacket, a brand new winter jacket. But who knows? Maybe that jacket was bought after the knife and after people saw him at the train station. But the only thing that really comes off as skater style, or if you want to say like an urban style, is that bucket hat. And there is yet another story that on December 31st, 2000, just hours after the Miyazawa family was brutally murdered inside of their home, that a man who was unidentified came into a hospital that was decently but not far enough away for it to be improbable away from the Miyazawa family's home, and had his hand treated but wished to stay anonymous. There was even a claim from a taxi driver who stated that after midnight, the early mornings of December 31st, like December 30th had just turned into December 31st, like just past midnight, a taxi driver claims that he picked up three men roughly in their 40s, not too far from the Miyazawa house. And he stated that it was weird because the three men didn't really speak to each other much, asked to be dropped off at the train station. And this cab driver also stated that one of the men were bleeding from their hands, and he only noticed this because he had stained the inside of his taxi with his blood. That bloodstain, however, was tested by police, and it did not belong to any of the Miyazawa family. And because of that claim, a lot of people started theorizing that it wasn't one killer, but most likely three. But the only thing is, from what I understand, the large amounts of blood and fingerprints seem to belong to one person, which could make sense if there were multiple people, but only one person got injured. But the fingerprints part doesn't line up with it being three unsubs. And a lot of the evidence, including some of the circumstantial evidence, seem to shout a lot of different things. But I think if we really look into all of the evidence and try to put them together, it might help to create a more accurate picture of who this unsub potentially could be. And I think one of the most important pieces of evidence outside of the DNA, obviously, is also the wild card evidence, and that is the sand that was found at the Edwards Air Force Base in Southern California. Because the thing about it is for the majority of us, sand, dust, all of it looks almost exactly the same. But for geologists who really specify in this, they're able to take rock and sand and pinpoint it within miles of a radius of where it most likely came from. Because you have to remember, sand and rocks are just made up from minerals, and the mineral makeup differs every single place. It's almost like a fingerprint where no two places are identical. They may have very similar properties and seem very similar, but geologists are able to take sand and be able to really pinpoint within a couple miles radius of where it most likely came from, which means that fanny pack was at the Edwards Air Force Base in the United States. And the police have also confirmed that only one set of fingerprints and DNA was on that fanny pack. So it wasn't like somebody who was on the Edwards Air Force Base in the United States sold it to someone else and they ended up inheriting it, or they just bought it. It doesn't seem likely either, which means that this person specifically themselves were at the Edwards Air Force Base in the United States. And I honestly think that is the biggest piece of evidence, because if you start the deduction process from there, it seems to make most sense that this person was of some mixed race from America, and they themselves are either or were in the military at the time, or, especially because the police are stating that the unsub most likely was either a teenager or in their early 20s. Initially, they thought it was someone between the ages of 15 and 35, possibly even 40. But over the course of the last decade or so, the Tokyo police have narrowed it down to most likely being someone in their late teens or early 20s, which makes me feel like it could have either been a newer person in the military or even a child of the military who are forced to move with their family. And a lot of the times, American soldiers would stick out like a sore thumb because they're not Asian. But this service member or their child was of East Asian descent, at least to a decent percentage, to the point where they didn't stick out as much. And if this person was in the military, it would also make sense as to why they potentially could have either been stationed or living in Korea or came to Japan by the way of Korea as well. Because there are US military bases stationed in South Korea and in Japan. So it could have been a thing where a couple of different scenarios within that, where it's a US military person either stationed in South Korea and they and or their family or just their family then traveled to Japan to do some traveling, or this family was stationed in Japan, had recently done a trip to Korea, or the third option is they were stationed in Korea and recently were transferred over to Japan. Either way, those three scenarios would easily explain how there was a Korean shoe that might have only been sold in a size that is available in Korea, and or how the clothing were all washed in hard water like they have in Korea as well. Now, I've read some conflicting reports on whether or not South Korea has been cooperative in trying to help identify this unsub, because I read a couple of reports stating that South Korea ran the fingerprints and the DNA in their database and either didn't find anyone. And I've also read a couple of reports stating that the South Korean government did find a match, but won't tell Japan who it is. Either way, the latter doesn't really seem that likely, although there have always been shaky waters in the relations between Japan and South Korea. In fact, the US military theory makes the most sense in this part as well, because the US military notoriously does not give out that type of information. And I haven't read any reports that say either way whether or not the Japanese police department have been trying to work with the US military to see if there's anyone identified in their database. And if we talk about it on this end, the theory that makes the most sense to me is that the unsub is the son of a really high-ranking officer in the US military that is of mostly East Asian descent, because that would mean that even if the US government had cooperated in this investigation, there would be no fingerprints that match an underage minor. Because I doubt that the US military takes the DNA information of any of the family members who are not actually serving. And if this was the act of the son of a high-ranking military officer, then there's no likely chance that the US military would freely give that information over to the Japanese government, because that would really mess up relations between Japan and the United States. Because over the last 24 years, this has become a highly, if not one of the most highly prioritized cases in all of Japan. This case is so important for the Japanese to solve that over the last 24 years, a culmination of over 280,000 investigators have been tied to this case. Just in 2015 alone, the Japanese police department stated that they still have 40 officers that are actively investigating this case. And as recently as in 2019, the Japanese police stated that they still have 35 officers actively working on this case. In fact, every year on the anniversary, the police department pay homage and pay respects to the family and the house. And the Japanese police have stated that they will never give up on this case until it is solved. And they have even put their money where their mouth is by offering the largest reward for any case in all of Japanese history by offering 20 million yen, or roughly around 150,000 American dollars, for any information leading to the arrest of the person responsible for the murders of the Miyazawa family. I don't know. I think the most frustrating thing about this case is that it could be and should be solved if not for a couple of things, like some of the privacy laws in Japan, not being able to do some of the investigative things with the DNA that might be able to really help move this case along. And based off of my theory that it is someone involved with the US military, that they're not giving any information as well, if they know anything at all. I'm not saying that they do, but if they do, I doubt that they're going to let the Japanese government know, because it will really sour international relations. And the reason why this case is so polarizing is because of the question, why? Why did this happen? Because it wasn't for a robbery. And if what the evidence seems to be pointing to is true, it almost seems as if this is a case where someone just kind of wanted to see what it was like to be a mass murderer. Because from what I understand, Interpol, the FBI, all have the fingerprints and the DNA information, and none of it matches their database of criminals, which means that whoever this person is went on a one-night spree to murder in cold blood 4 innocent human beings, 2 of which were merely children, and then never did it again. And this is the thing that really throws everyone off, because as what we know about murders is that people who have the propensity to do this type of evil to this extent typically can't just shake it off. They have this need, this desire that they have to itch. And it seems that this person, maybe they didn't kill again because maybe this person isn't alive anymore. But if this person is alive, they were able to hold off that itch for over 24 years, as far as we know. But at the end of the day, regardless of who could be the unsub, we have to remember that a family who loved each other and had a great and bright future ahead of them had their lives stripped and stolen from them for nothing but selfish reasons. And I hope that the unsub is identified sometime soon, just for the sheer sake of justice being served for this innocent family. And with that, I am Ed Choi, and you're listening to Patterns of Behavior, where we focus on the people behind the crime. I want to thank you for taking your time to listen to yet another episode. If you would like to help me keep this podcast sustainable, please think about joining the Patreon. Otherwise, you can find me on social media at Etch-a-Sketch with a J. If you are listening to the podcast, know that there are also video versions available on Spotify and on YouTube. Otherwise, thank you for joining me, and I'll see you on the next one. Stay safe.